Thank you. Okay, I'm just going to admit it. I'm really nervous, so I just got that out of the way. But I'm actually really excited to share with you my insights from being a reluctant leader for most of my career.
This is Margaret Lee. She's standing at the front of a room full of people. She's nervous. These are not just other people. This is the Leading Design Conference in London, a conference with global attendees specifically for, well, leaders in the design industry. Other speakers include leaders from design organizations like Slack and Pinterest, Capital One, MailChimp, Atlassian, and other names that you've heard of. Margaret is telling the room about the conflict that she's lived with for most of her life. This conflict led her to see herself as what she calls a reluctant leader. Welcome to the Google Method podcast. Today we have Margaret in the studio, and we're going to be talking about observing her parents as immigrant workers, what she's doing to redefine what leadership means, and also how she's hoping to channel the fearlessness and opinionated nature of her daughter into leadership qualities. All this as someone who has never really identified with being a natural-born leader.
Getting to this actually really gratifying point in my career has been somewhat of a reluctant journey that actually started long before any of these roles. So who I am as a leader has been deeply influenced by my life experiences and by my dad and his life experience.
Margaret, in your talk, you began by speaking about your heritage. And, I love this because I'm someone who, when I'm understanding something, I always start with the history of it and how we got there and how we became who we are. And I'm very interested in the story of your father. He was a stowaway.
Yes, so he ate cucumbers apparently for whatever length of time it took the ship to get from China to America. I'm guessing it was about 2 weeks. And I didn't know about this story until one day we were sitting around the dining room table at home, and for whatever reason, we had cucumbers, which was an unusual food for us to bring into the house up until that point. And it was his day off, and I remember he woke up and he kind of strolled through the kitchen and he saw us eating cucumbers and he just kind of scowled and said, "Oh, I hate cucumbers." And that was the first time I learned about the story of him being a stowaway, because he never talked to us about that before. And I learned about this that day, and I don't remember how old I was. I was maybe about 15, about his age when I learned about it, just totally by happenstance.
His age.
Yeah.
It's an amazing story of courage and hope and bravery. I'm wondering how these stories impacted you you're 15, I remember myself as 15, like totally different worldview from something like that. I'm wondering how these things impacted you growing up, hearing these stories.
There weren't huge aha moments in the moment. I think a lot of these had a slow burn for me. I would collect these stories I would hear by chance, just like the story of the cucumbers and why my dad couldn't look at a cucumber, without just feeling sick about it. I would collect these stories completely just by happenstance, and they would kind of accumulate, I think, in the back of my mind until at some point it became relevant for me. And I realized that my slow journey as a reluctant leader really reflected some of my family history and how it was such a slow trickle to come out, because speaking about the hard times isn't something that was done a lot in the house because it was just better left unsaid. Mm-hmm. And we were, focused on like, what can we do to get beyond the hard times?
Do you think that your opinion of that has changed? You're speaking about it now publicly. Do you think that you should not talk about the hard times, or is it worth going over?
I find myself wanting to talk about the hard times more, maybe because my son is 15 now. Mm-hmm. My daughter is 14. Their hard times look very different than my hard times, which look very different than my dad's hard times. And I think history is just a really important lesson that is a gift to us. And it took me a long time to maybe come to terms with my own history. And I just want to share it these days, not only with my kids, but just I've learned a lot, and why not share that?
Right. You've seen a lot too. You shared stories of seeing your mother and your aunties bring home, extra work from the sweatshops, and your father working in restaurants. And I'm wondering how you felt at that time. Did you feel like you had a place in all of that hustle?
Oh, we definitely had a place. They put us to work.
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, they put us to work. So, my grandmother and my mom and my stepmother, after my mom died, would continue to bring home all this extra work. And we would help them, so they would sew these collars, and we'd be put to work inverting them and taking a needle and making sure that the points of the collars were there, because they wouldn't get paid if they weren't perfect, right? So everybody pitched in. And sometimes on the weekends, my older sisters would go to the restaurant and help my dad out for a little bit of pocket change as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the big season was always Christmas, because Chinese restaurants were one of the only places left open to eat on Christmas, right? So that was a big day for business.
In your talk, you give this really incredible insight about your dad.
After the laundry closed, my dad went on to work in one suburban Chinese restaurant after another for decades. First in the back of the house as a dishwasher and then a cook. And eventually he moved to the better jobs in the front as a waiter and then a bartender. Getting these front of the house jobs was essentially like getting promoted. They were the better jobs. But it came with a trade-off. When he worked in the back of the house, he could speak Chinese to his coworkers and his friends. He was comfortable in his skin. But when he was serving customers in the front of the house, he had to assume a whole different persona. And this took a lot of effort, not just to speak a second language, but to understand the social norms that went with his customers, who were largely white, suburban, and middle class. So this was the metaphor as I went to school, graduated into the workforce, and proceeded down the leadership path. I carried that same duality of back and front of the house personas.
So tell me about this duality.
When I grew up in Boston, it was a very volatile time for race. Busing was being instituted in the city. And Boston in general was a very segregated culture, I think, environment. So I was always keenly aware of being different, as were, many other cultures, right? But I had my place. I stuck with the Chinese community outside of school, but inside of school, I had to integrate just into the general school population, right? So from an early age, I definitely felt that duality of, there was the home life and then there was the outside home life. And yes, that carried on into higher education, into the workforce. Even after I left Boston, I went to school in Philadelphia, another fairly racially charged city at times. And one of the reasons why I moved out to the West Coast was when I came out to the Bay Area, I actually felt like it was the first time that I saw a lot of people like myself, a lot of other Asians, and they were much more well integrated into the general population than what I had seen in either Boston or Philadelphia.
I'm interested in this metaphor that you give of back of the house to the front of the house. And I feel a lot of us have to put on a different suit when we come to work, or like a different face when we go to a different kind of social setting. And it can vary between, not just professionally, but like you go to a party or a gathering or maybe a work function or maybe home to your parents' house. You have to put on a different face. And I'm curious that you seem to be advocating to bringing the whole self forward. Am I understanding that right?
I am advocating that now because I realized for so many years that I hadn't done that myself. And I do a lot of mentoring now.
Mm-hmm.
And I see actually a very similar circumstance or struggle that a lot of women, I do a lot of mentoring for women, but not just women, and women of color, they have that similar back of the house, front of the house thing going on, because I think that they don't feel that who they are authentically is what's being asked of them at work. So that's where I'm really interested in having the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm so willing to talk about this right now, because if I can save some people that inner angst
Mm-hmm.
of always having to feel like they're making a trade-off somewhere, I think that would be great, because we talk about diversity and inclusion all the time in tech. And what does that really mean? It can't just be like, are we looking at it as a set of fixed demographics, right? That's certainly one way to measure it. But it goes so much beyond that. Like what are the qualities that people bring from different demographics that we're measuring? You know, are we really, really willing to have that full person's experience come into the workplace?
Yeah, these qualities are really interesting to me, and something that you outline and the conflict that can come when the qualities that are demanded in a workplace are aligned or just compared to the qualities that, you know, in your life you were given to, like the role to fill, you know. You mentioned going with the flow versus being disruptive, and being humble at home and in that life versus at work being asked to be the front man, being pushed into leadership positions, respecting authority versus being individualistic and being a mold breaker and things like that. I think that's so fascinating. And I'm wondering, how can you find harmony in those two halves?
That is at the crux of the struggle that I've had, you know, over the many years, is just sort of feeling my way through how much authenticity to bring to the workplace, and how much that I felt like, okay, here go my areas for development again, you know, because they were the same all the time. You know, it's like you have to speak up more, you have to represent more. You know, it was very much about, at least what I was hearing for so many years, is you have to be more out there. That for me was very different than how I was brought up and just who I naturally am.
Out there being like outspoken, like more visible?
Outspoken, really visible. You know, the fact that I even did that talk that you just played clips from, that was my first public talk that I've done, outside of like sitting on a panel or something, but where I was like, I have a topic that I really want to talk about, and I'm going to go out there for 30 minutes and do it.
Yeah.
That's something that I've just never wanted to do, or, you know, it would just give me the hives just thinking about it. But it was because I really wanted to talk about this now, because I see so many other people in this situation that's made me want to talk about it. But it's very different than how I was brought up. I realized that I can't do it alone, that it takes both sides, right? It's a relationship at work. It's not just me presenting myself. It's the expectations that we as a work culture have in everybody. And are we willing to have people bring their whole diverse selves to work, or are we just saying, okay, that filled the demographic requirement, now can you please do everything that we have always expected of everyone in the workplace, right? Like the culture tends to be a lot less diverse in terms of how we view leadership. And that's the duality that I was suddenly starting to realize, that, oh, it's not just for me to fix, it's for all of us to fix. I can do my part. I can bring my whole self to work, but is that going to be accepted? And not just me, but other people like me and other people not like me, because there's so many different types of leadership that could be possible if we just opened our minds about it.
So when we include a diversity of experience and cultures into our workforce, the expected outcome is a diversity of output. But the problem, or one of the problems we're running up against, is that leadership will still have the same expectations from a non-diverse workforce. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm not saying it's a intentional expectation even, but it's just that we've never challenged our notions of what leadership could look like.
Yeah. And in your talk, you make a really strong case for broadening the perspective of what leadership is.
So, in recapping the 5 things that we can do to broaden our perspectives on leadership, we can forget culture fit and be willing to get uncomfortable with the unknown. We can take the time and listen to learn, to invite inclusivity. We can expand our frame of reference to get out of the fixed mindset. We can own the problem and the solution of creating the culture that we want on our teams. And we can value non-jerks and discover just how rich leadership can be. These aren't difficult. None of these are difficult. But they will require conscious effort to shift our mindset and behaviors until it feels a little bit more second nature.
So you have a list of 5 things here that we can do to broaden our perspective of leadership. And they're very good. It's a good list. But I'm curious now, just as we're sitting here, is how you've seen these things play out in your own journey. Things like forgetting culture fit and listening to learn.
Well, the culture fit piece in many ways is at the core of what I'm talking about, because I think we talk so much about culture and the importance of culture, and I totally agree. But if we have a fixed perspective on what that culture means, then we're just perpetuating the same problem of lack of diversity. So when we talk about culture fit, a lot of times what we're talking about is the culture that we're comfortable with. Do you fit in? And that doesn't lead to diversity of thought. That just leads to reinforcing what already exists. And in terms of listening to learn, this is something I recently learned about in a leadership course that Google offers, which is fantastic. And it was just about how most of the time what we're doing in our day-to-day is we're usually just listening to fix the situation, because we're really efficient in our time, and that's what we're hired to do. We're hired to fix things. But when we're doing that, all we're doing is collecting information to just hone in on a solution. But you can't do that if you don't understand the situation. And that's where the listening to learn comes in, because if we're unfamiliar with other life experiences and the diversity of thought that comes from other cultures, we shouldn't be in this fixing mode because we don't know what we're fixing. Maybe there's something to fix. Maybe what we're in the position to do is just to learn about what other cultures and other life experiences can bring. And that will end up playing into a richer team culture, work culture, but also the thought that goes into the work that we're doing will be a lot more inclusive.
So I'm looking for a specific moment or a story in your own career where these principles have become very real.
Actually, a good example I talked about was this listening lunch that I took part in, where several of us female leaders were gathered to tell about our experiences as leaders in a very male-dominated leadership culture. Basically, to let our host know, and our host was a male leader, just some of the circumstances that he might not be aware of. Unfortunately, that was a good example of somebody not listening to learn, because I think people are so used to just wanting to help and wanting to fix things. So the intention might be really good, but it's really hard to sit back and not try to fix things and just to take it in. And what I've seen is that a lot of people just don't know how to do this yet. And it's a muscle that we haven't built.
I've learned about this recently in a different context, but I'm trained to assess and triage and fix, So, for example, if my wife is like, I'm frustrated because XYZ and this, my immediate is to say well, this is how we're going to fix it. But I've learned recently, and it's much harder to do, but just to step back and say, that must be hard for you. Tell me more. That's so difficult
It is
to
difficult.
do. But the outcomes actually are way more efficacious than if I were to try to fix it myself. Because a lot of the times, what we're looking for as humans is just expression, a little bit of solidarity, a little bit of understanding. And it goes so far.
That's an excellent way of putting it. Thank you for nailing that. That sense of solidarity and understanding is exactly the most important thing sometimes when somebody is coming to you vulnerable and seeking to be understood. They're not seeking to be quote unquote fixed, right? They're just seeking to be understood.
I mentioned earlier in our discussion that I love the way you started with history, and equally so, I thought it was really great how you kind of bookended your talk by looking toward the future, and you give this really great story of your daughter, Sophie, and her encounter with her grade school teacher.
Preschool is even before
even
kindergarten,
earlier.
yeah. When Sophie was 4, her preschool teacher, Miss Judy, called me into her office, and I was like, now what? What did she do now? Because she was kind of a troublemaker. And sure enough, Miss Judy started the conversation with, in my 25 years of teaching preschool, I've never lost control of the classes when Sophie starts clowning around. And this went on for a while, and I was just sinking lower and lower, and, in my seat, cringing, waiting for it to be over. But then her feedback took a sudden turn. The good news, Miss Judy said, is that these are signs of a natural-born leader. If we can help direct her tendencies, she'll do just fine.
I love on the slide deck, you have this picture of Sophie, and we can't like really show it on radio, but it's this 4-year-old little, the cute as a button little girl with a wastebasket on her head, and the look on her face is one of like defiance.
Absolutely.
and just like, yeah, so what? There's a wastebasket on her head. I don't know.
That's
It like
Sophie.
speaks volumes about what you're talking about. So maybe in the same way that we talked about the duality that existed in your father, tell me about the duality of Sophie.
Well, like Miss Judy observed, even at 4, she was exhibiting these quote-unquote leadership tendencies that just aren't recognized as such usually in a child, because in a child, they're just trouble. They're just undesirable traits, right? And so she is coming from the opposite angle of what I grew up with. And I recognize that this is just who she is. I mean, just the same way as I was just who I was, she's just who she is. And we all have these dualities of what we bring to the table just by nature, and then what we need to do to maybe become just more well-rounded in whatever profession or just even as human beings, right? Because I think we all have areas for development, not just at work, but just in life. And so we all have dualities of some sort. And maybe it's not just two, maybe it's trialities or, quadralities, whatever the terms are. But I don't think anybody is just one dimension. It's just we have our dominant tendencies, and then we have areas that we should be stretching out into. And I think if we all do that, I almost see it as like a systems level force where if everyone is willing to kind of stretch 30% beyond their natural abilities, we'll make a lot more connections with each other.
Yeah. I really like that you're focusing on this idea that people are more than just what we're asking them to be. And they're more than what their role describes them as. Thinking of somebody and trying to observe their duality, what does this give us when we kind of understand that people are more than that simple description?
It certainly opens the doors for what could be in a work relationship or personal relationship, or what somebody might bring to a team project. If we can expand upon this person actually has these perspectives and these skills that are not yet represented by the current team members, that's pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we as design leaders and as designers seek out that level of inclusivity in our design all the time. We're looking to understand people's needs and desires and their contexts and whatnot. Why wouldn't we be doing that on our team as well?
Yeah. And I feel like in a creative sense, being able to not only respect but understand people's multifaceted natures may open them up to just more resourcefulness, more creative solutions that don't really like fit the description of our job title. But I want to go over here because this is another part of myself and bring that in. And being aware and recognizing it enables that. Being told that you are this kind of person with this role will definitely, I feel, really close out those options.
It absolutely will. And I think that our roles as leaders, one of the things that we can do is recognize all these diverse possibilities on our team and to form these complementary dynamics on our teams that will just, in general, it'll amplify the effect, right? If we're all just kind of reinforcing each other's skill set, then we'll be really great at that one skill, but we won't have that full 360-degree effect that having truly complementary, diverse viewpoints can bring.
At the end of the talk, there's this really beautiful slide. It's a photograph, like on the left of your father. I think maybe it's from his documentation as he's coming into the States.
Yes.
He's a young man. He's 15.
Yep.
And then there's in the middle a photo of you as a child, and he's holding you. And then there's that Sophie photograph on the right. And I know your talk is very focused on leadership and bringing your full self to life's work. But I was wondering if you can do something else just right now for this conversation. I'm going to show you this slide here. Tell me what I don't see here.
My dad on the left, he has a suit on, and it is probably from when he was about 15. And it's a documentation. You don't see the rest of it there, but I know it's there, describing every birthmark on him. And he looks so serious. he's in a Sunday's best, right? Because he wants to come to this country. He's escaping poverty in the countryside. Many men of his generation were leaving China at that time in the 40s to make a better life and to send money back home, and that wasn't uncommon. So that's what's behind that photo. And in the middle, I don't know how old I am. I'm probably like 4 or something, and my dad and I are in the Boston Public Gardens, and it was probably a rare day off for him where he could take us to the park. He had 1 day off a week, and he worked 51 weeks a year. So it was rare for us to be able to go to the park, and it's one of the few photos I have like that. And then on the right, there's Sophie doing some salute or another. I don't remember exactly when that photo was taken, but she's probably about 5 or 6 and being cheeky as anything. And really, I think what I wanted to do in having these photos be side by side is just say, we're just a point in a continuum. Life goes on. Life was here before us, and life will be here after us. What kind of contribution can we make? We all have our particular struggles, and we all have our particular victories, but in the end, it's what are we leaving behind?
That's beautiful. I think just to support the whole argument of people are diverse creatures, and when I look at this, it means something to me, but having that context, that richness that you just brought to it, now it means infinitely more. And I'm really feeling that message that you're bringing of bringing your whole self, your whole identity to everything that you do makes every experience more rich. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
As always, you can find more information on the things we talked about in the show notes at design.google/podcasts. This episode was recorded and edited by Brian Gordon and produced by Barbara Eldridge. The artwork you see for each episode is created by Skip Hirsch. Subscribe to the show on Google Play, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you like this episode, please leave a review. It really helps new listeners to find the show and for us to know how we're doing. All right, that is it from us here at the Google Method Podcast. Thank you for listening.